Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently into the moonlit gardens of feudal Japan, where warriors once walked in silence between cherry trees, carrying swords that gleamed like captured starlight, living by a code that demanded everything and promised only honour, only duty, only the chance to meet death with dignity when the time came. Here, in this space between past and present, we wandered together through vanished worlds that time tried to erase but couldn't quite forget. We walked castle corridors where footsteps echoed 8 centuries ago, where voices once filled chambers now silent. We stand before armour displayed in museums, lacquered and still, yet once worn by men whose hearts beat with fear and courage in equal measure. We imagine the samurai who rode across misty valleys at dawn, who composed poetry before battle, who understood that life was as fleeting as morning dew on grass, as fragile as petals falling from spring branches, and who found in that fragility not despair but purpose. Each episode here isn't just about dates and battles. It's not about memorizing dynasties or the rise and fall of shoguns catalogued in textbooks. It's about the lives lived, the choices made in darkness, the priest-warrior kneeling before his ancestors' shrine at midnight, the young samurai learning to hold a brush before he learned to hold a blade, the moment when honour demanded the impossible and a man had to choose between life and loyalty. It's about the beauty they created, the mysteries they left behind, the questions that still whisper across the centuries waiting patiently for us to listen, to wonder, to remember. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and subscribe help. Keep this channel alive. Help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. In the 11th century, Japan existed in a world of contradictions, a place where refinement and violence lived side by side like uneasy neighbours, where court nobles composed poetry by candlelight, while armed men gathered in the provinces, sharpening blades and nursing grievances that would soon spill into open war. The imperial court at Kyoto remained the symbolic heart of the nation, glittering and cultured, a place where aristocrats spent their days perfecting calligraphy, arranging flowers, and debating the proper depth of a bow. But that world, beautiful as it was, had grown soft, disconnected from the realities of the countryside where power was increasingly measured, not in elegance but in strength, not in tradition, but in the ability to protect what was yours and take what wasn't. The emperor still sat upon his throne, descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, divine in theory but diminished in practice. Real authority had slipped through imperial fingers like water, pooling instead in the hands of the Fujiwara clan, regents who ruled in everything but name, marrying their daughters to emperors and controlling the succession. But even the Fujiwara were discovering that power built on court intrigue and arranged marriages could not hold back the rising tide of armed clans in the provinces, families who had learned that swords speak louder than poetry, that control of rice fields and mountain passes matters more than proximity to the throne. Out in the provinces, far from Kyoto's perfumed halls, a new class was emerging. They were called bushi, warriors, men who had started as guards for wealthy landowners, as enforcers for powerful families, as the muscle behind political ambitions. They rode horses across landscapes of stunning beauty, mountains shrouded in mist, valleys quilted with rice paddies that turned golden in autumn, forests of cryptomeria and bamboo where silence felt heavy enough to touch. They wore armour made of lacquered leather and iron, carried curved swords that had been folded and hammered into existence by smiths who treated their craft as sacred ritual. They were becoming something more than hired swords, developing their own identity, their own sense of purpose and pride. 2 clans rose above the others, families whose rivalry would define an era. The Taira, also called Heike, claimed imperial descent, wore red banners, and had begun to accumulate power through strategic marriages and military service to the court. The Minamoto, called Genji, also claimed imperial blood, flew white banners, and nursed old wounds, old defeats, biding their time in exile and provincial strongholds. Between these 2 families stretched a web of alliance and enmity, loyalty and betrayal, honour and ambition that would eventually tear the country apart. The common people lived as they always had, planting rice in spring, harvesting in fall, paying taxes to whoever controlled their land, whether that was a court noble, a Buddhist monastery, or an increasingly powerful warrior clan. They built their lives around the rhythms of agriculture and the cycles of the seasons, marked time by festivals and harvests rather than political intrigue. When armies marched through their villages, they bowed and survived. When temples burned, they rebuilt. When new lords claimed dominance, they adjusted. Survival demanded flexibility, demanded the ability to bend like bamboo in the wind rather than break like oak. Buddhism had woven itself deep into the fabric of Japanese life by this time, monasteries dotting mountainsides, monks chanting sutras that drifted through morning mist like prayers made visible. But even Buddhism was changing, adapting to this warrior age. New sects emphasized sudden enlightenment, direct experience, discipline and meditation that appealed to men who lived with death, who needed to find peace not in scholarship but in action, not in contemplation alone but in the union of thought and deed. Zen would find fertile ground in the hearts of warriors seeking meaning in a life defined by violence. The natural world remained what it had always been, achingly beautiful, marked by the passage of seasons in ways that inspired both joy and melancholy. Cherry blossoms bloomed in spring for just a few brief weeks, their petals falling like snow, reminding everyone who saw them that beauty and life are temporary, that nothing lasts, that this moment, this breath, this single flower is all we ever truly have. Mountains stood eternal or seemed to, their peaks hidden in clouds, their slopes covered in forests where spirits were said to dwell. Rivers ran clean and cold, carved paths through stone, mirrored the moon on still nights. This was the world before the storm, before the wars that would transform Japan forever, before the samurai became what history remembers. It was a world in transition, traditional structures crumbling, new ones not yet fully formed, a society balanced on the edge of profound change. The stage was set, the players were gathering, and though no one could have known it then, the moonlit nights ahead would be filled not just with poetry and cherry blossoms, but with the clash of steel, the cries of the dying, and the birth of a warrior code that would define a nation for 7 centuries to come. The first Europeans to truly encounter the samurai saw something that both fascinated and confused them, warriors who seemed to embody contradictions that Western minds struggled to reconcile. When Portuguese traders arrived in the 16th century, they found men who could decapitate an enemy without hesitation, yet wrote poetry that spoke of life's transience with heartbreaking sensitivity. Jesuit missionaries sent reports back to Rome describing a warrior class that practiced Zen meditation, arranged flowers, performed tea ceremonies with movements as precise as any religious ritual, and yet thought nothing of ritual suicide if honour demanded it. These early observers saw pieces of the truth but could not yet assemble them into a coherent picture. But the real discovery of the samurai, the uncovering of their world in all its complexity, came much later, in the decades after Japan opened to the West in the mid-1800s. For more than 2 centuries, Japan had sealed itself away from foreign contact, a choice made by shoguns who feared that European influence would destabilize their carefully controlled society. During that isolation, the samurai had continued to exist, had continued to train and practice their arts, but their role had gradually shifted from warriors to administrators, from fighters to bureaucrats who still wore swords but rarely drew them. When American warships arrived in 1853 demanding that Japan open its ports, the old order began to crack. In the chaos that followed, in the rapid modernization that transformed Japan from feudal society to industrial power in just a few decades, many artifacts of samurai culture were discarded, seen as embarrassing remnants of a backward past. Castles were torn down, swords were melted, armor was sold to antique dealers. The samurai class itself was abolished in 1876, their stipends ended, their right to wear swords revoked. Former warriors found themselves adrift in a world that suddenly had no place for them, their skills obsolete, their code seemingly irrelevant in an age of railways and factories and Western-style armies. Yet even as Japan rushed to modernize, even as it built steel mills and established a constitution modelled on European examples, there were those who recognized that something precious was being lost. Scholars began collecting what remained, gathering swords and armour, copying old texts before they crumbled into dust, interviewing the last generation of men who had actually lived as samurai rather than merely studied them. Museums were established, archives were created, and slowly, painstakingly, the material culture of the samurai was preserved. Archaeological discoveries added depth to the historical record. Excavations of battlefield sites revealed the brutal reality of medieval warfare. Mass graves filled with bones bearing the marks of sword cuts, arrowheads embedded in earth, fragments of armour scattered across fields that had been quiet for centuries. Temple repositories yielded treasures, scrolls containing everything from military tactics to philosophical treatises, paintings that depicted battles and ceremonies, letters written by warriors to their families before going to war, messages that bridged the centuries with their raw humanity. Personal diaries proved especially valuable, windows into the inner lives of men who rarely spoke openly about their doubts and fears. One such diary, kept by a samurai named Asahi Matazemon during the 16th century, survived purely by accident, discovered in the wall of a house being demolished in the 1930s. His entries revealed a man torn between duty and doubt, recording his training, his battles, his struggles with the code he was supposed to embody. He wrote of watching cherry blossoms fall and wondering if he would see another spring. He wrote of the weight of his armour and the heavier weight of expectation. He wrote of killing men in battle and being unable to forget their faces. His words made the samurai real in ways that official histories never could. The swords themselves became objects of intense study, each blade a work of art and a historical document. Master swordsmiths had signed their work, dated it, sometimes even inscribed the blade with information about who commissioned it and for what purpose. Metallurgists analysing these swords discovered techniques that wouldn't be replicated in the West for centuries, processes of folding and tempering steel that created weapons of remarkable strength and sharpness. The curve of a blade, the pattern of the temper line, the balance and weight, all these details told stories about the evolution of sword making, about changing styles of combat, about the men who wielded them. Castles that survived provided physical evidence of how the samurai lived and fought. Walking through structures like Himeji Castle, with its maze-like defences and hidden passages, its strategic placement commanding river crossings and mountain passes, visitors could understand the military genius behind their construction. The living quarters within revealed another side. Rooms designed for tea ceremony, gardens created for meditation, spaces where warriors could pursue the arts of peace, even while preparing for war. Foreign collections also played a role in preservation. European and American collectors had acquired samurai artifacts during the late 1800s, when such items were cheap and plentiful in Japan itself. These collections, scattered across museums from Boston to Berlin, preserved objects that might otherwise have been lost, and in the 20th century, as Japan began to reassess its relationship with its own past, these foreign-held treasures became important resources for scholars and curators. The discovery was not just of objects, but of understanding, a gradual recognition that the samurai were not simply warriors, not merely soldiers in fancy armour, but participants in a complex culture that tried to reconcile violence and beauty, duty and humanity, the needs of society and the desires of the individual. Each artifact uncovered, each text translated, each battlefield excavated, added another piece to an intricate puzzle, helping later generations understand what it meant to live by the sword, in a world where honour mattered more than life itself. When the West first encountered detailed accounts of samurai culture in the late 19th century, the response was immediate, intense, and deeply divided. For a public raised on stories of European chivalry, the samurai seemed like a fascinating parallel. Knights of the East who followed their own code of honour, fought for their lords, and lived by principles that seemed both familiar and exotically different. Writers and artists embraced them eagerly, incorporating samurai imagery into everything from adventure novels to philosophical treatises, often with only a superficial understanding of what they actually represented. Lafcadio Hearn, a Greek-Irish writer who moved to Japan in 1890 and eventually became a Japanese citizen, was among the first to introduce Western audiences to the spiritual and aesthetic dimensions of samurai culture. His books painted a picture of a refined, almost mystical warrior tradition, emphasizing the poetry and philosophy, the cherry blossoms and moonlit contemplation. He wrote of warriors who faced death with such equanimity that they could compose final poems of stunning beauty moments before committing seppuku. His work found an eager audience in Europe and America, readers hungry for alternatives to industrial modernity, for examples of societies that had maintained honor and tradition in the face of change. But not everyone was convinced. Skeptics pointed out that Hearn and writers like him were romanticizing what was essentially a brutal military caste, glossing over the violence and oppression that were intrinsic to samurai rule. Historians questioned whether the beautiful philosophy described in texts like the Hagakure, a collection of samurai wisdom compiled in the early 1700s, actually reflected how warriors behaved, or was instead an idealized version created after the fact, nostalgia masquerading as history. They noted that the most famous samurai texts were often written during the Edo period, when Japan was at peace and the samurai had become bureaucrats rather than warriors, suggesting that the romantic image of the samurai was itself partly a construction, a myth created by men who had never actually tested their swords in battle. In Japan itself, the response was equally complex. For a generation trying desperately to modernize, to prove that Japan could compete with Western powers on their own terms, the samurai represented both pride and embarrassment. On one hand, they were proof of a rich cultural heritage, warriors whose discipline and loyalty could be held up as examples of Japanese virtue. On the other hand, they symbolized everything that had held Japan back, a feudal past that had to be overcome if the nation was to survive in the modern world. The government oscillated between celebrating samurai heritage and trying to suppress it, between erecting statues to famous warriors and banning the wearing of swords. Nitobe Inazo's book Bushido, The Soul of Japan, published in 1900 and written in English for a Western audience, tried to bridge these contradictions. Nitobe, a Christian academic who had studied in the United States, presented Bushido as a coherent ethical system comparable to Western chivalry, a way of thinking that could be admired even by those who had never held a sword. His work was immensely influential, shaping how both Japanese and foreigners understood the samurai code, but it was also controversial, accused of creating a unified philosophy where none had existed, of imposing Christian concepts onto Buddhist and Confucian traditions, of inventing a Bushido that served modern nationalist purposes rather than reflecting historical reality. Common people in Japan had their own complicated relationship with samurai memory. Many families still told stories of ancestors who had been samurai, preserving heirlooms, practicing martial arts that had been passed down through generations. But they also remembered the harsh realities of samurai rule, the taxes and restrictions, the casual violence that samurai could inflict on commoners without consequence, the legal privileges that had allowed samurai to cut down anyone who showed them disrespect. A right called kiriste gomen had ended with the Meiji Restoration. But the memory lingered, a reminder that honor and brutality were not opposites but often companions. Scholars began the painstaking work of separating myth from reality, analyzing primary sources, comparing different accounts, trying to understand what samurai life had actually been like beneath the layers of romanticism and propaganda. They found contradictions everywhere. Warriors who wrote exquisite poetry, but also committed atrocities. A code that emphasized loyalty but was honored as often in the breach as in the observance, with countless examples of samurai betraying their lords when it served their interests. A supposedly unified warrior culture that actually varied enormously depending on time period, region, and individual clan traditions. The debate about the samurai, about what they represented and whether they should be admired or condemned, intensified in the 20th century as Japan's own trajectory took dark turns. Militarists in the 1930s and 40s invoked Bushido to justify aggression and conquest, claiming that samurai values demanded absolute loyalty to the emperor and contempt for surrender. After Japan's defeat in World War II, the samurai became suspect again. Their code blamed for encouraging the fanaticism that had led to so much destruction. The occupying American forces even banned the practice and teaching of martial arts for several years, seeing them as potential sources of militaristic revival. Yet through all these shifts in perception, the fascination remained. Museums dedicated to samurai culture drew crowds. Films about legendary warriors became international successes. Martial arts schools teaching kendo, iaido, and other samurai disciplines spread around the world. People remained drawn to something in the samurai story, perhaps the idea that it was possible to live by a code, to find meaning through discipline and duty, to face mortality with dignity. Whether that something was historically accurate or a beautiful fiction, continued to be debated, but the power of the image endured. Moonlight on steel, cherry blossoms falling, a warrior standing alone against the darkness, ready to do what honor demanded no matter the cost. The samurai of legend and the samurai of history are not quite the same creature, and the distance between them reveals as much about human nature as it does about medieval Japan. In popular imagination, the samurai is a figure of almost supernatural discipline and honor, a warrior who would rather die than break his word, who faced every challenge with calm acceptance, who lived according to Bushido with the precision of a monk following monastic vows. This image, polished and perfected over centuries, has a certain beauty to it, a clarity that makes the samurai easy to admire, easy to hold up as an ideal. But history, as it always does, tells a messier, more complicated, more human story. The contradiction begins with the very concept of Bushido itself. The word means way of the warrior, and it suggests a unified code, a clear set of principles that all samurai followed. But no such unified code existed during the height of samurai power. Different clans had different customs, different expectations, different ideas about what honor meant and how it should be expressed. A samurai serving the Takeda clan in the mountains of Kai province might have very different notions about proper behavior than one serving the Shimazu clan in distant Kyushu. Regional variation was enormous, shaped by geography, by local traditions, by the personalities of individual lords, and the specific challenges their domains faced. What we think of as Bushido was largely codified during the Edo period, from 1600 to 1868, when Japan was at peace and the samurai had been transformed from warriors into administrators. During those 2.5 centuries, former fighters became bureaucrats, men who still wore 2 swords but rarely drew them, whose battles were fought with brush and ink in government offices rather than with steel on muddy fields. It was during this long peace that samurai scholars began writing treatises on the warrior way, creating philosophical systems that explained what it meant to be samurai, what virtues they should embody, how they should think and act. But they were writing about a warrior ideal from the safety of peacetime, constructing a romantic vision of what samurai should have been rather than documenting what they actually were. The reality was often far less noble. Medieval warfare in Japan was brutal, chaotic, and driven as much by personal ambition and material gain as by any lofty ideals. Samurai fought for their lords, yes, but they also fought for land, for status, for the chance to increase their family's wealth and power. Betrayal was common, lords switching sides when it seemed advantageous, warriors abandoning losing causes to join winning ones. The famous loyalty that supposedly defined the samurai was real in many cases, but it was equally often a convenient fiction, honoured when it served one's interests and discarded when it didn't. The practice of taking heads in battle illustrates the gap between ideal and reality. After killing an enemy, a samurai would typically decapitate the corpse and take the head as proof of his valour, as evidence that could be presented to his lord to claim reward. This was standard practice, considered normal and necessary. The heads would be washed, the hair combed, the face made presentable before being displayed and inspected. Officials would verify the quality of the kills, heads of high-ranking enemies worth more than those of common soldiers. This system turned battle into a grim marketplace, where death was currency and severed heads were receipts. It was practical, efficient, and completely at odds with the refined image of the contemplative warrior poet. Samurai were also capable of extraordinary cruelty, particularly toward those they considered beneath them. The right to test a new sword on the bodies of criminals or even on living prisoners, a practice called tameshigiri, was sometimes exercised with a casualness that speaks to how thoroughly dehumanized the lower classes were in samurai eyes. Stories exist of samurai cutting down peasants who failed to show proper respect, the kiriste gomen privilege mentioned earlier, and while it's unclear how often this actually happened versus how often it was merely threatened, the fact that it was legally permissible reveals the enormous gulf between warrior and commoner in feudal Japan. Yet the contradictions run in both directions. For all their violence, many samurai genuinely did pursue arts and philosophy with deep seriousness. The same man who had killed dozens in battle might spend years perfecting his calligraphy, studying the precise angle of brushstrokes, the balance of composition, the way ink flowed on paper. He might practice tea ceremony with a focus that bordered on religious devotion, learning to make every movement meaningful, to find in the simple act of preparing and sharing tea a meditation on impermanence and presence. He might write poetry that captured the melancholy beauty of autumn leaves or morning mist with such sensitivity that it moves readers centuries later. This combination of violence and refinement wasn't hypocrisy so much as a different way of understanding the world. In the samurai world view, the ability to kill and the ability to appreciate beauty were not opposites, but complements, two aspects of a complete human being. Death was ever present, life was fleeting, and that very transience made beauty more precious, made each moment matter more intensely. A warrior who understood that he might die tomorrow had powerful motivation to fully experience today, to notice the cherry blossoms, to taste the tea, to write the poem. The awareness of mortality sharpened appreciation for life rather than dulling it. The most famous samurai in legend, figures like Miyamoto Musashi or the 47 Ronin, embody these contradictions. Musashi was a brilliant swordsman who killed dozens of men in duels, who lived rough and homeless for much of his life, sleeping in caves and under bridges, but he was also a painter of considerable skill, a philosopher who wrote about strategy and self-cultivation, a man who spent his final years in quiet contemplation. The 47 Ronin avenged their master by meticulously planning and executing a raid that ended with the deaths of their enemy and his guards, an act of violence they knew would result in their own ordered suicides. They were celebrated as paragons of loyalty, yet their loyalty required them to break the law, to kill outside the bounds of legal warfare, to become technically criminals in pursuit of honor. Perhaps the deepest contradiction is that the samurai code emphasized acceptance of death, taught that a warrior should consider himself already dead so that he could act without hesitation or fear, and yet this acceptance was supposed to lead not to nihilism, but to a fuller engagement with life. By letting go of attachment to survival, by embracing the certainty of eventual death, the samurai was supposedly free to act purely, to make choices based on what was right rather than what was safe. In theory, it was liberation through acceptance. In practice, it was a philosophy that could justify both sublime self-sacrifice and horrific violence, depending on how one interpreted what honor demanded in any given moment. The contradiction between legend and reality, between the ideal samurai and the actual warriors who lived and died in medieval Japan, cannot be fully resolved. Both versions contain truth. The samurai were brutal when brutality was required, refined when refinement was possible, loyal when loyalty served them, treacherous when treachery offered advantage, capable of both poetry and murder, often within the same hour. They were human, in other words, trying to live by a code that demanded more than humans can consistently give, creating a legacy that inspires and troubles in equal measure, that speaks to both our highest aspirations and our capacity for self-deception, our ability to make beauty and meaning even in the midst of violence and death. Among scholars who have devoted their careers to understanding the samurai, consensus is rare and controversy is constant. The debates are not merely academic hair-splitting but fundamental disagreements about what the samurai were, what they represented, and what their legacy means for understanding both Japanese history and human nature more broadly. These arguments have shaped how the samurai are portrayed in everything from museum exhibits to popular films, influencing how millions of people around the world imagine these warriors and their world. One major point of contention centers on the origins of Bushido itself. Some historians argue that a recognizable warrior code existed as early as the Kamakura period in the 1200s, that the values later formalized as Bushido were already guiding samurai behavior centuries before anyone wrote them down. They point to early texts, to letters between warriors, to documented examples of loyalty and self-sacrifice that seem to reflect a shared understanding of proper warrior conduct. In this view, Bushido was organic, arising naturally from the lived experience of the warrior class, later refined and articulated but not invented by Edo period scholars. Others vehemently disagree, insisting that Bushido as a coherent system was largely a creation of the Tokugawa peace, a nostalgic invention by warriors who no longer fought, an attempt to give meaning and purpose to a class that had lost its original function. They note that the word Bushido itself doesn't appear in written sources until relatively late, that earlier warriors spoke of Kubo no Michi, the way of horse and bow or other regional terms, but not of a unified code called Bushido. In this interpretation, what we think of as samurai values were retroactively imposed on the past, a mythology created to serve the needs of the present. The debate extends to the religious and philosophical foundations of samurai culture. Some scholars emphasize the influence of Zen Buddhism, arguing that its emphasis on direct experience, on transcending dualistic thinking, on finding enlightenment in everyday action, was perfectly suited to warriors who needed to act decisively without hesitation. They point to the many samurai who practice Zen meditation, to the close relationships between warrior clans and Zen monasteries, to the aesthetic sensibilities shared between Zen monks and cultivated samurai. Zen, in this view, gave philosophical depth to the warrior's life, transforming violence into a path toward understanding. But others caution against overstating Zen's influence, noting that many samurai were more influenced by Confucian ideas of loyalty, hierarchy, and social obligation than by Buddhist concepts of enlightenment. Confucianism, particularly the Neo-Confucian variants that became popular during the Tokugawa period, provided a framework for understanding the samurai's role in society, explaining why loyalty to one's lord was paramount, why social order mattered, why everyone had their place in a cosmic hierarchy. For these historians, reducing samurai philosophy to Zen is a mistake that ignores the complex mix of influences that actually shaped warrior thinking. There is also vigorous debate about the role of women in samurai culture. Traditional accounts largely ignore women or relegate them to supporting roles, wives and mothers who managed households while men went to war. But recent scholarship has uncovered evidence of Onna Bugeisha, female warriors who trained in combat, who defended their homes when attacked, who in rare cases even led troops in battle. Documents describe women of samurai families learning to use the naginata, a bladed pole weapon, both for self-defense and as a point of pride. Some researchers argue that these martial women were far more common than previously thought, that the historical record minimized their presence because later, more conservative eras were uncomfortable acknowledging women's participation in warfare. Yet even here there is disagreement. Critics point out that while some samurai women certainly received martial training, this was typically defensive in nature. Preparation for protecting the home rather than engaging in offensive warfare. They warn against projecting modern sensibilities onto the past, against wanting samurai women to have been proto-feminists when they actually lived in a deeply patriarchal society. The truth, as usual, likely lies somewhere between erasure and exaggeration. Women who had more agency and capability than traditional accounts suggest but less freedom and equality than modern viewers might hope. The economic foundations of samurai power generate their own scholarly conflicts. Some historians focus on the samurai as a military aristocracy, emphasizing their role as warriors, their monopoly on legitimate violence, their function as the armed enforcers of political power. Others argue that understanding the samurai requires looking at economics first, at their control of land and agricultural production, at the complex systems of taxation and obligation that supported their lifestyle. In this view, the samurai were fundamentally a landlord class who justified their privileges through military service, but whose actual power rested on control of peasant labor and rice production. The question of samurai psychology also divides scholars. Were they genuinely committed to their stated values, truly willing to die for honor and loyalty? Or were they mostly pragmatic actors who used the language of honor to justify self-interested behavior? Some researchers take samurai writings at face value, seeing in their letters and diaries evidence of men who genuinely struggled to live up to demanding ideals, who took their obligations seriously even when doing so cost them dearly. Others read the same sources with more skepticism, seeing performance and self-justification, men who told themselves stories about honor to make sense of violence and ambition. Modern Japanese scholars sometimes find themselves in an awkward position, studying a warrior class that is central to Japanese cultural identity, but also potentially embarrassing in its violence and hierarchy. Some embrace the samurai as exemplars of Japanese virtues, as proof that Japan has a rich tradition of discipline, loyalty, and aesthetic refinement. Others are more critical, arguing that overemphasis on samurai culture obscures the experiences of the vast majority of Japanese people who were not warriors, who suffered under samurai rule, who built Japan's actual economic and cultural achievements while being largely ignored in favor of romantic stories about men with swords. Western scholars bring their own biases, sometimes idealizing the samurai as exotic others who maintain traditions that the West has lost, sometimes condemning them as representatives of feudal oppression, not fundamentally different from European knights or any other warrior aristocracy. The tendency to see the samurai as uniquely Japanese versus seeing them as one example of a universal pattern of warrior culture generates its own scholarly disputes, arguments about whether culture or material conditions matter more in shaping human societies. What unites all these debates is a recognition that the samurai matter, that understanding them is important not just for grasping Japanese history, but for thinking about broader questions of how societies organize violence, how codes of conduct evolve, how mythology and reality interweave, how people find meaning in difficult lives. The arguments continue, new evidence emerges, interpretations shift, but the fundamental questions remain, echoing across centuries, asking us to consider what honor means, what loyalty demands, what price we are willing to pay for the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who we ought to be. The work of uncovering samurai reality from beneath layers of legend requires patience, skepticism, and the ability to read between the lines of sources that were never meant to be objective historical records. Scholars approach this task like detectives examining a crime scene centuries after the fact, gathering fragments of evidence, testing theories against facts, building pictures of the past from incomplete and often contradictory information. The investigation continues today, each generation of researchers bringing new questions and methods to bear on old materials, finding new meanings in documents that have been read countless times before. Primary sources form the foundation of this investigation, but using them requires caution. Letters written by samurai to their lords or families provide insights into their concerns and values, but they were written for specific audiences and purposes, not as neutral accounts. A warrior writing to his lord before battle might emphasize his loyalty and courage, not because he was lying, but because that was what the situation demanded, what his role required him to say. Reading such letters means looking for what is not said as much as what is, noticing the gaps and silences that might reveal deeper truths. Military chronicles like the Heike Monogatari, which recounts the Genpei War, or the Taiheiki, which describes the conflicts of the 14th century, are invaluable, but also problematic. These works were written decades or even centuries after the events they describe, blending history with legend, often including supernatural elements alongside factual accounts. Warriors transform into demons, ghosts appear on battlefields, divine intervention determines outcomes. Separating historical core from literary embellishment requires comparing multiple sources, looking for details that appear consistently across different accounts, understanding the conventions of the genre and the purposes for which these chronicles were composed. Archaeological evidence provides a reality check against written sources. Excavations of battlefield sites reveal what actually happened when armies clashed, showing the messy truth of medieval warfare. Mass graves contain skeletons with wounds that tell stories, sword cuts on arm bones suggesting defensive postures, arrow points embedded in vertebrae, skulls bearing the marks of execution. The bones don't lie about who died and how, though they cannot tell us why, cannot reveal motivations or allegiances or whether the dead considered themselves heroes or victims. Castles and fortifications offer their own testimony. Walking through the preserved structures, studying their design and construction, researchers can understand the practical realities of samurai warfare. The placement of archer positions, the design of gates meant to funnel attackers into kill zones, the multiple layers of defense, all these features speak to a sophisticated understanding of military architecture. But they also reveal priorities, the resources that went into making these structures not just functional, but beautiful. Gardens and tea houses within defensive walls, spaces designed for peaceful arts in the midst of preparations for war, samurai armor and weapons, studied closely, tell stories about technological development, about changing tactics, about the men who wore and wielded them. The evolution from the Yoroi armor of the Kamakura period, heavy and box-like, to the lighter, more flexible Tosi Gosoku of later eras, reflects changes in warfare, the shift from mounted archery to fighting on foot with spears and firearms. Each piece of armor was custom-made for its wearer, sized to fit his body, decorated according to his taste and his family's traditions. Museums preserving these artifacts allow researchers to examine the craftsmanship up close. to understand the skill required to create them, to imagine the men who once relied on them for protection. Temple records provide unexpected insights into samurai life. Buddhist monasteries kept detailed accounts of donations received, services performed, burials conducted. These records reveal which samurai families supported which temples, what ceremonies they sponsored, how they prepared for death. Reading through temple archives, researchers find wills in which warriors specified how their property should be divided, what prayers should be said for their souls, what they wanted remembered about their lives. These documents are often more personal, more honest than official histories, windows into private concerns and family relationships. Legal documents too prove valuable. Court records from the Kamakura and Muromachi periods contain cases involving samurai, disputes over land, accusations of misconduct, lawsuits between warriors and their lords, or between warriors and commoners. These dry legal texts reveal how the system actually worked, what happened when ideals conflicted with interests, how honor was invoked in practical disputes over money and power. They show samurai as litigants and defendants, people navigating complex social and economic realities, not just warriors contemplating death and cherry blossoms. Modern techniques add new dimensions to the investigation. DNA analysis of remains can establish family relationships, confirm or challenge traditional genealogies, reveal patterns of marriage and alliance that shaped clan politics. Metallurgical study of swords can determine where the iron ore came from, what techniques the smith used, sometimes even identify the specific swordsmith who made a particular blade. Pollen analysis of archaeological sites can reconstruct the landscape as it existed centuries ago, showing what plants grew around castles and battlefields, helping researchers understand the environmental context in which samurai lived. Comparative study with other warrior cultures provides perspective. Looking at European knights, Mongol warriors, Mamluk soldiers, researchers can identify patterns common to warrior aristocracies across different cultures and patterns that seem unique to Japan. This comparative approach helps distinguish what was universal about the samurai experience, shaped by the universal realities of pre-modern warfare and feudal social organization, from what was culturally specific, arising from Japanese religious thought, aesthetic traditions, and particular historical circumstances. Interviewing descendants of samurai families, particularly those who preserved family records and heirlooms, adds a living dimension to historical research. Some families maintained oral traditions, stories passed down through generations that complement and sometimes complicate the written record. While such memories must be treated carefully, knowing how they can shift and change over time, they sometimes preserve details that written sources omit, the small human particulars that make history real. Language itself proves crucial to the investigation. Classical Japanese is difficult, full of nuances and ambiguities, and many important texts remain inadequately translated or studied. Scholars who can read these sources in the original often find meanings that earlier translations missed or misrepresented, subtleties of tone and implication that change our understanding of what samurai thought and believed. The work of translation is never finished, each generation finding new layers in old words, new questions to ask of ancient texts. The investigation continues because the questions evolve. Each answer generates new questions. Each discovery reveals new gaps in knowledge. Each generation brings its own concerns to the study of the past. The samurai become a mirror in which we see not just medieval Japan, but ourselves, our own struggles with violence and beauty, duty and freedom, the demands of society and the desires of the individual. Piecing together the truth about them means also piecing together truths about human nature, about how we create meaning in the face of mortality, how we build identities that can bear the weight of our contradictions. The tangible remnants of samurai culture scattered across museums and private collections around the world form a vast, fragmented archive of medieval Japan. Each object is evidence of lives lived according to principles that seem both familiar and alien to modern sensibilities. Proof that the samurai were not merely legends but real people who wore specific armor, wielded specific swords, lived in specific places, and left behind specific things. These fragments, properly understood, allow us to reconstruct their world with surprising detail. Swords represent perhaps the most iconic evidence of samurai existence. Japanese blades were not simply weapons but sacred objects, believed to contain the spirit of the smith who forged them and to embody the soul of the warrior who carried them. The best swords were signed and dated, the smith's name inscribed on the tang hidden beneath the handle, creating a provenance that can be traced back centuries. Museums carefully preserve thousands of these blades, each one a testament to extraordinary craftsmanship. Steel folded dozens of times to create layered structure that combines hardness with flexibility, edges sharpened to impossible keenness, curves calculated to optimize cutting geometry. The pattern of the Heian, the temper line visible along the blade's edge, is unique to each sword, created by the specific way the smith applied clay before heating and quenching the steel. Experts can identify not just which school or region produced a blade, but often which individual smith made it, reading in the Heian a signature as distinctive as handwriting. Some swords have known histories, documented ownership passing from one famous warrior to another, blades that were present at pivotal moments in Japanese history, that cut down notable enemies or were laid as offerings at important shrines. Armor tells a different story, one of practicality meeting aesthetics in ways that reveal samurai values. A full suit of samurai armor, called yoroi in earlier periods, or gusoku in later ones, consisted of hundreds of individual parts, laced together with silk or leather cord in patterns that allowed flexibility while providing protection. The construction was ingenious, small iron or leather plates overlapping like scales, distributed so that the armor could move with the wearer, allowing him to fight on foot or mounted, to draw a bow or swing a sword without the armor impeding his motion. But samurai armor was also decorated, often elaborately. Helmets featured crests, sometimes simple metal ornaments, sometimes fantastic constructions representing animals, demons, or mythological beings. Breastplates bore family crests in gold or lacquer. Even the lacing that held the plates together came in different colours, patterns that identified the wearer's clan and rank. A samurai going into battle was not trying to be inconspicuous, but to be recognised, to make sure that his deeds would be properly witnessed and his kills properly attributed. The armour had to protect but also to proclaim identity, to transform the wearer into a visible embodiment of his family's honour. Everyday objects preserved in museum collections reveal the texture of samurai life beyond warfare. Writing implements show how seriously they took calligraphy, brushes and inkstones worn smooth by use, practice papers covered in repeated characters as warriors worked to perfect their hand. Tea ceremony implements, bowls and whisks and bamboo scoops, often simple and rustic in aesthetic but profound in the care given to their selection and use, demonstrate the importance of these peaceful arts. Painting supplies, musical instruments, game boards for go and shogi, all these things speak to lives that encompassed more than fighting. Documents provide the richest evidence but require the most interpretation. Land deeds show the economic basis of samurai power, records of who owned what fields, what taxes they could collect, what obligations came with the land. Genealogies trace family lines through generations, marriages and adoptions creating networks of alliance that shaped politics and warfare. Letters of commendation from lords to retainers formalize relationships, specify obligations, record promises made. Wills dispose of property, arranging for younger sons and daughters, ensuring that family traditions would continue, sometimes expressing last wishes about burial and memorial rites. Some documents are intensely personal. Poems written before battle, knowing death might come, express emotions with raw honesty, fear and courage mingled, acceptance of fate alongside longing for life. Letters to wives and children speak of love and duty, try to explain why honour demands what it demands, attempt to leave wisdom and guidance for those who would be left behind. Reading these messages across the centuries, we encounter samurai not as archetypes, but as individuals, men with names and families and hopes and regrets, whose mortality was real, and whose acceptance of it was never quite as complete as the ideal demanded. Archaeological sites add physical context to written and material evidence. The ruins of castles, some preserved and restored, others mere foundation stones overgrown with vegetation, show where samurai lived and how they organized space. Excavations reveal the layers of daily life, broken pottery and discarded tools, animal bones from meals, coins and bits of armor and fragments of weapons. Battlefields, identified through historical records and confirmed through finds of arrowheads and human remains, allow researchers to reconstruct what happened, where armies positioned themselves, how the fighting progressed, who won, and at what cost. Even the landscape itself serves as evidence. Forests that samurai planted for timber still grow on mountainsides. Stone walls built to channel water for castle moats still shape modern drainage patterns. Shrines and temples that warrior families patronize still stand, some maintaining records that document centuries of devotion and donation. The geography that shaped samurai tactics, mountain passes that were fought over, rivers that marked boundaries between domains, plains where cavalry could maneuver, all these features remain readable to those who know how to look. Foreign accounts provide an outside perspective on the evidence, observers from China, Korea, and Europe, describing what they saw when they encountered samurai. These accounts sometimes confirm Japanese sources, sometimes contradict them, often notice details that Japanese writers took for granted and therefore didn't mention. Portuguese missionaries described samurai behavior in letters to Rome. Chinese merchants noted Japanese martial practices in their journals. Korean envoys recorded their impressions of Japanese warriors. These external witnesses help calibrate the internal Japanese sources, showing what was unique to Japanese warrior culture and what was typical of pre-modern warrior aristocracies more broadly. Collectively, this evidence paints a picture that is detailed in some areas, frustratingly vague in others. We know what samurai wore and carried, what weapons they preferred, what castles they built. We have some understanding of their values and motivations, though the gap between stated ideals and actual behavior remains difficult to bridge. We can trace their political history with reasonable confidence, though individual stories often remain obscure. The evidence is enough to say with certainty that the samurai existed, that they were central to Japanese history for centuries, that they created a distinctive culture that balanced violence and refinement in ways that continue to fascinate. But it is not enough to fully answer every question, not sufficient to resolve every contradiction, not adequate to let us truly understand what it felt like to be a samurai, to live in that world, to face death according to that code. The fragments remain fragments, precious but incomplete, testimony to a lost world that we can glimpse but never quite reach. Beneath the surface narratives of samurai honor and loyalty, beneath the documented battles and political intrigues, lies a deeper mystery that historical records rarely address directly, but that permeates the culture once you know to look for it. It is the mystery of how individual human beings actually lived with the demands of Bushido, how they reconciled the code's requirements with their own desires and fears, how they maintained identity and sanity in a system that demanded they think of themselves as already dead. The official histories present samurai as exemplars of their code, but the quieter evidence suggests a reality far more psychologically complex and often more troubled. The code told samurai that their lives belonged to their lord, that personal desire was selfishness, that attachment to life was weakness to be overcome. They were taught from childhood that death in service was the highest honor, that the only real failure was to die badly, without dignity, without having served their purpose. This was not merely philosophical abstraction, but practical preparation for a reality in which violent death was common, where battles could erupt with little warning, where political miscalculation by one's lord could mean sudden attack and siege. Living under such conditions required psychological armor as much as physical protection. But humans are not easily molded into perfect instruments of duty. Evidence of the strain appears in the private writings that survived, the moments when the mask slipped and doubt showed through. Warriors wrote poems expressing weariness, longing for peace, questioning whether the endless training and vigilance was worth the price. Some mention nightmares, recurring dreams of battles fought, faces of men killed, ghosts demanding to know why they died. These admissions were rare, violating the expectation that a true samurai accepted everything without complaint. But their very rarity makes them more valuable as evidence of what was really felt beneath the stoic surface. The practice of ritual suicide, seppuku, carries its own dark mystery. Officially, it was an honorable death, a way for a samurai to take responsibility for failure or to avoid the dishonor of capture, a privilege denied to commoners. The ritual was formalized, procedures developed to make it as dignified as possible, given the inherent horror of self-disembowelment. A kaishakunin, a designated second, would stand ready to decapitate the person committing seppuku at the moment of maximum pain, turning what would otherwise be an agonizing death into something quicker, more merciful. The person dying could compose a final poem, leave last words, perform the act with witnesses present to attest to his courage. But what did it actually mean to prepare for this? To know that if you failed your lord, if you brought dishonor to your family, if circumstances aligned against you in certain ways, this would be expected, demanded even. Young samurai trained not just in swordsmanship and archery, but in the proper way to commit suicide, the correct posture, the right depth and direction of the cut, how to maintain composure through unimaginable pain. Fathers taught sons. The knowledge was passed down as carefully as any other martial skill. What psychological toll did this take, growing up knowing that suicide might be not just a possibility but a duty? Some samurai seem to embrace it, wrote about death with what appears to be genuine acceptance, even eagerness. The Hagakure, that collection of samurai wisdom, contains the famous line that the way of the warrior is found in death, that a samurai should meditate on death every morning and evening, make himself constantly ready for it, so that he can act without hesitation when the moment comes. But was this embrace of death actual wisdom, or a kind of culturally sanctioned dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed men to function in impossible circumstances by detaching from the instinct for self-preservation that defines most human behavior? The mystery deepens when considering the samurai who broke, who couldn't maintain the facade, who fled from battle or betrayed their lords, or simply collapsed under the weight of expectations. These failures were rarely recorded in official histories, their stories suppressed because they contradicted the narrative of samurai perfection. But they must have existed because humans always exist who cannot or will not conform to impossible standards. What happened to them? How were they regarded by their fellows? What became of samurai who wanted to live more than they wanted to die honorably, who chose survival over the code? There is also the mystery of belief, of how much samurai actually believed in the religious and philosophical frameworks that supposedly gave their lives meaning. Buddhism taught that life is suffering, that attachment causes pain, that enlightenment comes through letting go of ego and desire. Confucianism taught that social harmony requires everyone to fulfill their role, that loyalty to superiors maintains cosmic order. Shinto suggested that the ancestors watched, that proper ritual kept the world in balance. Did samurai believe these teachings sincerely, or were they convenient stories that made difficult lives bearable, narratives that gave structure and meaning to violence and death? The evidence suggests that belief was as varied as the individuals involved. Some samurai were deeply religious, devoted practitioners of Zen or fervent believers in Pure Land Buddhism, men who found genuine solace and meaning in spiritual practice. Others seemed more pragmatic, going through the motions of religious observance because it was expected but showing little sign of deep conviction. Still others actively questioned, wrote poetry that bordered on nihilism, expressed doubt about whether death in battle actually led to any reward, or whether it was simply the end, consciousness extinguished, meaning dissolved. The relationship between samurai fathers and sons carries its own mysterious weight. Fathers had to train their sons for lives that might end violently at any moment, had to instill both skill and psychological conditioning, had to be simultaneously loving and harsh. How did they balance affection with the necessity of preparing children for death? What did it mean to look at your young son and know that you were raising him to potentially die in his 20s in some provincial conflict, to accept that possibility not just intellectually but emotionally, to push him toward that fate because it was his role, his duty, what his birth demanded? There are hints in the sources of samurai who struggled with this. Letters from fathers to sons going to war for the first time mixing pride with barely concealed anxiety. Poems written by warriors who had lost sons in battle, expressing grief that seems to contradict the official narrative that such death should be celebrated as honorable. Wills that make careful provision for surviving children, trying to ensure they would be protected and cared for, suggesting attachment and concern that theoretically should have been transcended. The mystery ultimately centers on consciousness itself, on the internal experience of being samurai. The external forms are documented, the armor and swords, the castles and battles, the political structures and social hierarchies. The official ideology is recorded in countless texts, the explanations and justifications, the philosophy and poetry, but the actual lived experience, what it felt like inside one's own mind to be a person caught between human nature and inhuman demands, between the desire for life and the requirement to embrace death, between love for family and loyalty to Lord. This remains mysterious, accessible only through fragments and glimpses, moments when the historical record accidentally reveals something true. Perhaps this mystery is ultimately unsolvable. Perhaps we can never fully understand what it meant to be samurai because we do not live in their world, do not face their choices, do not carry their burdens. But the attempt to understand, the effort to see past the mythology to the psychological reality, reveals something important about all human beings, about how we create meaning in difficult circumstances, how we survive impossible demands, how we live with contradictions that cannot be resolved, only endured. The samurai's deeper mystery is finally a human mystery, one we still grapple with today, though in different forms and under different names. The Genpei War, fought between 1180 and 1185, was the conflagration that transformed Japan from a realm nominally ruled by emperors and courtiers into a society dominated by warriors, the conflict that established the samurai as the ruling class for centuries to come. It was a war between two great clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, but it was also more than that, a civilizational shift disguised as a political struggle, the moment when the old order broke and a new one emerged from the ruins, written in blood and validated by the sword. The Taira clan had risen to prominence through military service and political cunning, particularly under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori, who became the first warrior to effectively dominate the imperial court. By the 1170s, the Taira controlled much of western Japan, had married their daughters into the imperial family, held most of the important government positions. Kiyomori's grandson was emperor, making the Taira the power behind the throne, the real rulers of Japan even if they nominally served imperial authority. They had achieved what no warrior clan had before, translating military might into political supremacy. But their success bred resentment. The old court aristocracy chafed under warrior rule, mourning the loss of their influence even as they adapted to new realities. Other warrior clans resented Taira dominance, particularly the Minamoto, who had their own claims to power, their own history of service, their own ambitions. The Minamoto had been defeated in earlier conflicts, scattered to the provinces, but they endured, maintained their identity, waited for opportunity. That opportunity came when Prince Mochihito, dissatisfied with Taira control over imperial succession, issued a call for warriors to rise against them in 1180. The war began badly for the Minamoto. Prince Mochihito was quickly killed, his rebellion seemingly crushed before it could truly start. But his call had awakened something in the provinces, a willingness among warriors to challenge Taira supremacy. Minamoto Yoritomo, who had been living in exile in Izu province, used the call as justification to raise an army. He was a survivor, politically astute, willing to be patient and ruthless in equal measure. In the east, far from Kyoto and Taira power, he began building a base, gathering allies, creating the military and political structure that would eventually triumph. The war spread across Japan, battles fought in mountains and along coastlines, sieges of castles and raids on supply lines, diplomacy and betrayal as clans chose sides, or switched them as fortune shifted. It was not a simple confrontation between two armies, but a complex web of local conflicts, family feuds given new stakes, ambitious warriors seeing opportunity in chaos. Some battles were massive, thousands of warriors clashing in decisive engagements. Others were small, raids and ambushes, individual samurai earning glory or meeting death in encounters barely recorded by history. The Taira initially held advantages, controlled more territory, had more resources, dominated the seas with their naval power, but they faced structural problems. Their position at court had made them soft, some argued, too accustomed to political maneuvering, less prepared for sustained military campaigning than provincial warriors who had remained closer to their martial roots. Their dominance had created enemies, other clans willing to ally with anyone who might break Taira power. And they faced in the Minamoto not just military opponents, but rivals who understood the political dimensions of warfare, who were building not just an army, but an alternative government. Minamoto Yoshitsune, Yoritomo's younger brother, emerged as the Minamoto's greatest military commander, a brilliant tactician who won victories that seemed impossible. At the Battle of Ichinotani in 1184, he led a cavalry charge down a cliff face that should have been impassable, surprising the Taira army and routing them. At Yashima, he conducted a raid across the inland sea, attacking a Taira position thought to be secure. His victories made him famous, a hero to his warriors, a terror to his enemies, but also a potential threat to his brother, whose political control required that no one else in the Minamoto clan become too powerful. The final battle came at Dan-no-ura, in the strait between Honshu and Kyushu, in the third month of 1185. The Taira fleet, carrying what remained of their forces and the child Emperor Antoku, met the Minamoto navy in waters the Taira had long dominated. The battle began in the morning, ships manoeuvring, archers exchanging volleys, warriors trying to board enemy vessels and fight hand-to-hand on swaying decks. At first, the tide favoured the Taira, their naval experience showing, but as the day wore on, the tide changed literally, currents shifting to favour the Minamoto, and some Taira allies switched sides, turned their ships against their former comrades. The Taira broke, ships were sunk or captured, warriors drowned or were cut down. Rather than face capture and dishonour, many Taira threw themselves into the sea, choosing death over surrender. The Empress Dowager, grandmother of the child emperor, took young Antoku in her arms and jumped from the ship, drowning them both, preferring to end the imperial line rather than see him become a prisoner of the Minamoto. The scene was apocalyptic, the water filled with drowning men, the wreckage of a once mighty clan sinking beneath the waves. The Minamoto victory was complete. The Taira were destroyed as a political force, their leaders dead or scattered, their lands confiscated. But the significance went beyond the defeat of one clan by another. Yoritomo did not return power to the imperial court, did not restore the old system. Instead, he established his base at Kamakura, far from Kyoto, and created a new form of government, the Bakufu, a military administration that would rule Japan in the emperor's name but without the emperor's actual authority. In 1192, he received from the emperor the title of shogun, officially recognizing what was already reality, that a warrior now ruled Japan. This was the turning point, the moment when medieval Japan became definitively a warrior society, when the samurai transformed from servants of power into power itself. The emperor remained, still sacred, still necessary to legitimize authority, but real control had shifted permanently to those who commanded armies, who held land, who could enforce their will through force of arms. The world that emerged from the Genpei War would endure for 7 centuries, a feudal system in which warriors ruled, in which the way of the sword determined who held power, in which Bushido became not just a personal code but the ideology of a ruling class. But the war also revealed something darker, the costs of the transformation. Thousands had died, entire families destroyed, the land ravaged by years of combat. The romantic ideal of samurai warfare, individual warriors meeting in honourable single combat, had given way to brutal reality. Mass slaughter and strategic calculation, victory going to those willing to do whatever was necessary. The honour culture that would later define the samurai was born in a war that showed how little honour mattered when survival and power were at stake, a contradiction that would haunt the warrior class throughout their existence, the gap between what they claimed to be and what they had to do to maintain their position. The establishment of the Kamakura Shogunate in the years following the Genpei War fundamentally restructured Japanese society, creating a dual system of government that would define the nation for centuries. The emperor remained in Kyoto, surrounded by courtiers who maintained elaborate ceremonies and cultural traditions, still theoretically the source of all legitimate authority, descended from the sun goddess and therefore sacred. But actual power resided in Kamakura, where Minamoto Yoritomo built a military government staffed by warriors, administered according to warrior values, enforced by warrior strength. This division between symbolic authority and real power became one of the defining features of Japanese political life. Yoritomo proved as skilled at governing as he had been at war, though his methods were cold and ruthless. He understood that military victory alone was not enough, that power had to be institutionalized, made systematic and enduring rather than dependent on individual prowess. He created positions and offices, appointed military governors called shugo to each province, established estate stewards called jito to manage confiscated Taira lands, and ensure proper collection of taxes. These appointments went to warriors who had supported him, creating a network of obligation and mutual interest, samurai whose power depended on the shogunate and who therefore had reason to maintain it. But Yoritomo also understood the danger of potential rivals, particularly within his own family. His brother Yoshitsune, the brilliant general whose victories had secured Minamoto triumph, became a threat precisely because of his success, because warriors loyal to him might challenge Yoritomo's supremacy. Accusations were manufactured, Yoshitsune was declared a traitor, hunted across Japan until finally cornered. Rather than surrender, Yoshitsune committed seppuku in 1089, dying according to the code even though that code had been manipulated to destroy him. His death demonstrated that the new order would be as ruthless with its own as with its enemies, that loyalty flowed upward but not necessarily downward, that power preserved itself without sentiment. The warrior class itself underwent transformation under the new system. Before the Genpei War, samurai identity had been somewhat fluid, warriors serving various masters, relationships often temporary and based on immediate mutual benefit. The Kamakura system formalized these relationships, creating clear hierarchies of obligation, defining who served whom, establishing expectations that a warrior's loyalty to his lord should be absolute and hereditary, passed from father to son like the land itself. This formalization created the foundation for Bushido as a systematic code, the idea that there were right and wrong ways to be a samurai, standards that could be articulated and enforced. The legal system developed by the Kamakura shogunate reflected warrior values and priorities. The Joi Shikimoku, a legal code promulgated in 1232, was relatively simple compared to earlier court law, focusing on practical matters of land rights, inheritance, and warrior conduct. It assumed that disputes would often be settled through force, but tried to channel that force through legitimate procedures, duels conducted under supervision, arbitration by respected warriors, appeals to the shogun's authority. The law recognized that samurai lived by different rules than commoners, that their status gave them both privileges and responsibilities, that honor mattered as much as legal technicality in judging their actions. Economic consequences rippled through society. The warrior government required resources, rice and money to pay retainers, maintain castles, fund military campaigns when necessary. The tax burden fell heavily on peasants, who found themselves supporting not just the old court aristocracy, but also a new warrior class. Some peasants were tied more firmly to the land, their freedom of movement restricted to ensure a stable agricultural workforce. Others found opportunity in the disruption, cleared new fields, developed new techniques, slowly expanded the agricultural base that supported the entire system. The relationship between warriors and peasants became more direct, less mediated by court aristocrats, creating bonds of mutual dependence that would characterize rural Japan for centuries. Buddhism adapted to the new reality, producing forms more suited to warrior sensibilities. Pure Land Buddhism, which taught that salvation came through faith rather than monastic discipline, appealed to warriors who lacked time for extensive study and meditation, but needed spiritual comfort in the face of violent lives. Zen Buddhism, brought from China and refined in Japan, offered a path that integrated seamlessly with martial practice, suggesting that enlightenment could be found in any action performed with complete focus, whether meditating or fighting, that the mind that achieved clarity in meditation was the same mind that acted without hesitation in battle. Temples became centers of learning and culture, but also military strongholds, some developing their own armies of warrior monks, blurring the line between spiritual and temporal power. The old court aristocracy did not disappear, but declined in influence and wealth. They continued to perform ceremonies, to create art and literature, to maintain cultural traditions that warriors increasingly admired and emulated. In some ways, the courtiers became curators of civilization, preserving aesthetic refinement while warriors provided security and governance. The relationship was sometimes cooperative, sometimes tense, aristocrats resenting their loss of power while recognizing their dependence on warrior protection, warriors simultaneously despising courtier softness and envying their cultural sophistication. Women of the samurai class experienced contradictory changes. Some lost rights they had previously held, particularly regarding property inheritance, as the warrior emphasis on maintaining family military strength led to primogeniture becoming more common, estates passing to eldest sons rather than being divided among all children. But women could still inherit under certain circumstances, particularly if there were no male heirs, and some became formidable figures in their own right, managing estates, negotiating marriages, even occasionally commanding troops in defense of their homes. The Onobugeisha, warrior women trained in the naginata, became recognized types, their martial skills acknowledged even as their primary role remained domestic. Trade and commerce found new patterns under warrior rule. The shogunate needed merchants to supply military needs, metal workers to make armor and weapons, shipbuilders to construct vessels, traders to bring goods from distant provinces. Ports and market towns grew, protected by warrior authority, taxed by warrior governments, gradually creating a commercial economy that coexisted with and eventually undermined the agricultural base of warrior power. Coins came into wider use, money supplementing rice as a measure of wealth and medium of exchange, introducing market logic into relationships that had been governed by custom and obligation. The physical landscape of Japan changed as well. Castles multiplied, first simple wooden structures on easily defended heights, later elaborate complexes of stone walls and multiple baileys, dominating the countryside, symbols of warrior power visible for miles. Roads improved to allow rapid movement of troops, relay stations established where messengers could change horses, communication networks spanning the archipelago. Villages reorganized around warrior strongholds, commoners clustering near castles for protection, creating settlement patterns that would persist for centuries. The consequence of the Genpei War and the Kamakura Shogunate was thus not simply a change in government, but a transformation of society, the creation of a warrior-dominated order that shaped every aspect of Japanese life. The rise was the rise of the samurai to ruling status, their values becoming society's values, their needs shaping economic and social structures. But it was also a fall, the decline of older forms of authority and culture, the loss of whatever freedoms and protections had existed under the previous system, the subordination of civilian to military logic, peace to the requirements of war. Japan became a nation organized for conflict, and even during times of peace, the shadow of the sword fell across everything, determining who held power, who had rights, who mattered in the eyes of the law and the eyes of history. The legacy of the samurai extends far beyond medieval Japan, their influence radiating through time and across cultures in ways both obvious and subtle. The immediate and direct impact was on Japan itself, where warrior rule persisted until 1868, shaping national character, cultural values, social structures, and political institutions for 7 centuries. But the samurai also became a global phenomenon in the modern era, their image and ideals appropriated, adapted, and reinterpreted by societies around the world, making them perhaps the most internationally recognized symbol of Japanese culture, more famous globally than they ever were constrained to their island nation. Within Japan, the samurai established patterns of loyalty and hierarchy that survived long after the class itself was abolished. The emphasis on group harmony over individual desire, on duty to one's superiors and organization, on maintaining face and avoiding direct confrontation, these cultural traits that foreigners often identify as distinctly Japanese have roots in the samurai system, the lifetime employment system that characterized major Japanese corporations in the 20th century, where workers remained with one company throughout their careers in exchange for job security and gradual advancement, consciously echoed the samurai relationship with their lords, translating feudal loyalty into corporate culture. The influence appears in Japanese arts, both traditional and modern. The aesthetic principles that guided tea ceremony, flower arrangement, calligraphy, and garden design were deeply shaped by samurai patronage and values, their emphasis on simplicity, restraint, attention to detail, finding profound meaning in small gestures. Martial arts like kendo, iaido, judo, and aikido preserve and transmit samurai techniques and philosophy, though often in forms modified for peacetime practice, turning what were lethal combat skills into paths of self-cultivation. These martial arts spread globally, millions of practitioners around the world learning not just techniques but philosophical approaches derived from Bushido, ideas about discipline, respect, and the unity of mind and body. Japanese cinema found in the samurai a perfect subject, creating an entire genre of films that explored warrior culture from every angle. Directors like Kurosawa Akira made works that were simultaneously deeply Japanese and universally human. Samurai films that resonated with audiences who had never heard of Bushido because they addressed timeless questions about courage, duty, justice, and mortality. Seven Samurai, Kurosawa's masterpiece from 1954, was remade as The Magnificent Seven, transplanting the story to the American West, demonstrating how samurai narratives could be translated across cultures, the specific details changing but the underlying themes remaining powerful. Anime and manga, Japan's dominant popular culture exports, frequently feature samurai or samurai-influenced characters, introducing global audiences to warrior aesthetics and values. Stories set in feudal Japan, characters wielding katanas and following codes of honor, narratives exploring themes of loyalty and revenge. These elements appear across countless works, from serious historical dramas to fantastical adventures. Young people in countries around the world form their first impressions of Japanese culture through these media, learning about samurai not from history books but from entertainment, creating a modern mythology that mingles historical fact with creative invention. The business world embraced samurai imagery and philosophy, though often in simplified or distorted forms. Books applying Bushido principles to corporate strategy became bestsellers, suggesting that samurai wisdom about discipline and loyalty could improve business performance. The warrior ethos was invoked to justify everything from rigorous quality control to corporate loyalty, sometimes insightfully, sometimes absurdly. The samurai became a brand. Their image used to sell everything from knives to motorcycles, their association with quality, precision, and traditional craftsmanship exploited for marketing purposes. Western military institutions studied samurai history and philosophy, finding in Bushido a different approach to warrior culture than European traditions offered. The emphasis on accepting death, on loyalty unto death, on finding meaning in service, these ideas fascinated military thinkers, some of whom tried to incorporate Bushido concepts into their own training and culture. During World War II, American and Allied forces studied samurai traditions to understand their Japanese enemies, trying to predict behavior, to comprehend why Japanese soldiers fought with such ferocity, why surrender was so rare, why kamikaze pilots willingly flew to their deaths. The answers they found in Bushido were both illuminating and terrifying, revealing a warrior culture that could inspire extraordinary dedication but also enable horrific violence. The dark side of samurai legacy also deserves acknowledgement. Bushido was invoked to justify Japanese militarism in the early 20th century, used to glorify war and condemn peace, to demand absolute obedience to authority, to shame anyone who questioned aggressive policies. The warrior ideal became a tool of propaganda, samurai values twisted to serve imperial ambitions, the code that once governed a medieval warrior class repurposed to mobilize an entire nation for total war. After Japan's defeat, the samurai heritage became controversial, associated with the nationalism and militarism that had led to disaster, a legacy that had to be carefully reconsidered and recontextualized. Modern Japan maintains a complex relationship with its samurai past. Tourists visit preserved castles and samurai districts, watch demonstrations of martial arts and traditional crafts, collect swords and armor, fascinated by a warrior culture that seems exotic precisely because it is so thoroughly past, safely historical. But Japanese people themselves often have more ambivalent feelings, pride in their heritage mixed with awareness of the violence and hierarchy that characterize samurai rule, appreciation for the arts and philosophy mixed with discomfort about the values of absolute loyalty and acceptance of death that Bushido promoted. Scholarly understanding of the samurai has become more nuanced and critical over time. Historians now emphasize the diversity of samurai experience, the changes across different periods, the gaps between ideal and reality, the ways that Bushido was as much constructed mythology as lived reality. They caution against romanticizing warrior culture, against seeing the samurai as uniquely noble or Japanese warrior values as fundamentally different from those of other pre-modern military aristocracies. This scholarly demystification hasn't diminished popular fascination, but has made it more complicated, introducing shades of grey into a picture that popular culture often prefers in black and white. The impact of the samurai on philosophy and psychology extends beyond Japan. The idea that accepting death can lead to living more fully, that discipline and practice can achieve mastery, that ritual and form can deepen meaning, that beauty and violence can coexist. These concepts resonate across cultures. Zen Buddhism, so closely associated with samurai culture, became influential in the West partly through that association. People drawn to meditation practice and aesthetic principles that seem to offer alternatives to Western materialism and individualism. Whether this Western Zen accurately reflects Japanese traditions or represents a creative misreading is debatable, but the influence is real. In the end, the samurai shaped the modern world not through military conquest, Japan having remained largely isolated until the modern era, but through cultural influence, through the power of their story and the resonance of their ideals. They became a mirror in which different cultures see different things, warriors who can represent discipline or violence, loyalty or blind obedience, aesthetic refinement or brutal hierarchy, acceptance of death or contempt for life. The samurai mean what each generation and culture needs them to mean, flexible symbols whose historical reality matters less than the ideas they embody, the questions they raise about how to live with dignity in the face of mortality, how to find meaning in a world that offers no guarantees, how to balance individual desire with social obligation, how to make beauty in the midst of violence. These questions remain urgent, which is why the samurai remain relevant, why their legacy continues to shape our world centuries after the last samurai died. Behind the grand narratives of wars and political transformations, beneath the philosophical treatises and aesthetic achievements, existed individual human beings, samurai whose names history mostly forgot, whose specific struggles and joys went unrecorded, but whose collective experience gives flesh and blood to what otherwise remains abstract. These were the common warriors, men who served minor lords in remote provinces, who trained and waited and worried, whose lives were shaped by the same code and social structures as famous generals, but who themselves never achieved fame, never led armies, never had their poems preserved for posterity. Consider the young samurai, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, receiving his first real sword, not a practice weapon, but a blade that had taken lives and might take more. His father presents it in a ceremony that is both proud and solemn, speaking words about duty and honor that the boy has heard countless times, but that suddenly carry new weight. The sword is heavy, heavier than the wooden practice swords he has wielded for years. It is beautiful, the blade catching light in ways that make it seem alive, the lacquered scabbard decorated with his family crest. He understands that this weapon makes him truly samurai now, that he has crossed a threshold, that adult responsibilities and adult dangers await. His training has been rigorous, starting young with basics, endless repetition of stances and strikes, building muscle memory until his body moves correctly without conscious thought. He has learned to shoot a bow from horseback, galloping past targets and releasing arrows at full speed, the rhythm of the horse's stride merging with the rhythm of his breathing. He has practiced with the spear, with the naginata, with various weapons that might save his life in different situations. He has studied too, learning enough characters to read and write, studying military classics, listening to older warriors tell stories of campaigns and battles, absorbing lessons about tactics and strategy, and the unpredictable chaos of actual combat. But no amount of training prepares him for the reality of his first battle. When it comes, perhaps a border skirmish with a neighbouring domain, perhaps a larger conflict in which his lord has chosen a side, the experience is overwhelming in its intensity and confusion. The smell hits him first, smoke and sweat and something else. Something metallic and organic that he will later recognize as the smell of blood and opened bodies. The noise is tremendous, shouting and screaming, the clash of weapons, war cries and death cries, horses neighing in fear and pain. His carefully trained techniques fragment under pressure. He fights mostly on instinct and adrenaline. Terror and excitement mix so thoroughly that he cannot distinguish between them. He kills a man, manages to cut down an enemy warrior in the chaos, feels his blade bite into flesh and bone, sees the shock and pain in his opponent's eyes, watches him fall. The moment is simultaneously triumphant and horrible, proof of his skill and the end of a life, and he has no time to process what he feels because the battle continues around him, other enemies threatening, his comrades calling out, the situation shifting moment by moment. Later, when it's over and his lord has won or retreated and survivors are collecting themselves, he will remember that face, will wonder who the man was, whether he had family, whether he died well. The memory will return unbidden at quiet moments, a ghost that haunts not with malice but with insistent presence, refusing to be forgotten. The samurai who survives his first battles enters a cycle of training and waiting, punctuated by occasional violence. Most of his life is not fighting but preparation for fighting, maintaining equipment, practicing skills, fulfilling administrative duties if he is literate and trusted, standing guard at his lord's castle or escorting officials on journeys. The waiting can be harder than the fighting. Nothing to do but think. Worry about when the next conflict will come, whether his lord will make wise choices or foolish ones, whether he will die in the next battle or the one after that or survive to old age. Some warriors cope by throwing themselves into training with renewed intensity, others by pursuing arts, poetry or painting or tea ceremony, creating beauty as counterbalance to the violence they might have to commit. Marriage comes, arranged by his family to cement alliances or strengthen clan ties. His wife is also samurai-born, raised with her own understanding of duty and expectations, knowing that her primary role is to manage the household, bear children, and maintain family honor while her husband serves his lord. The relationship may grow into love or may remain formal and distant, affection, not required though not forbidden. She trains with the naginata, learns to defend the home if enemies come while the men are away, accepts that her husband might die at any time and that she must be prepared to carry on, to raise children alone if necessary, to maintain the family's position and reputation regardless of personal grief. Children arrive, sons who must be raised as warriors, daughters who must be prepared for marriage into other samurai families. The father sees himself replicated in his sons, feels the weight of passing on not just techniques but values, the entire structure of what it means to be samurai. He is simultaneously tender and harsh, loving his children while knowing that love cannot protect them from the demands of their station, that preparing them for their roles requires being strict, sometimes cruel, pushing them harder than he would like because the world will push harder still. When his eldest son receives his first sword, the cycle completes, the father becoming his own father, passing on what was passed to him, continuity spanning generations. The samurai grows older, if he's fortunate enough to survive. His body accumulates scars, old wounds that ache in cold weather, reminding him of battles fought decades ago. He has buried comrades, attended funerals, delivered death notifications to families, the rituals of loss becoming grimly familiar. He has served his lord faithfully, or faithfully enough, navigating the complex politics of clan life, maintaining his position, ensuring his family's security. If he's very fortunate and very skilled, he may receive a larger stipend, a better position, recognition that elevates his family's status. If he is less fortunate, he maintains what he has, grateful that he has not lost it, that his children have places to go, that the line continues. In his final years, he may retire from active service, passing responsibilities to his sons, spending time in contemplation or religious practice, preparing for death with the same discipline he brought to life. He has lived according to the code as well as he could, not perfectly because perfection is impossible, but sincerely, trying to embody the ideals even when they conflicted with his desires, with his fear, with his love for family. He composes a death poem, if he is literate and has time, a few lines expressing what a lifetime has taught him, usually something about impermanence, about cherry blossoms falling or snow melting. The conventional images carrying personal weight when written by someone who has lived them fully. These forgotten voices, these ordinary samurai whose individual stories mostly vanished into time, were the substance of the warrior class, the actual people who lived the code and suffered its demands and found whatever meaning and joy they could in difficult lives. History remembers the generals and the famous duels, the great battles and political intrigues, but it was built on the backs of countless men whose names we will never know, who trained and fought and died according to expectations they did not choose, who were brave and frightened and dutiful and human, whose collective experience created the reality behind the legend, the lived truth beneath the myth. The samurai system, for all its power and cultural dominance, never achieved complete hegemony over Japanese society. Throughout the centuries of warrior rule, opposition emerged from various quarters. People who resisted the code, questioned the hierarchy, refused to accept that might made right or that birth determined worth. These resistors took different forms, from peasant rebels to warrior reformers to religious dissenters, each challenging the system from their own position, each paying different prices for their resistance, each revealing cracks in what otherwise seemed monolithic. Peasant uprisings occurred with surprising frequency. Collective explosions of anger against excessive taxation, arbitrary punishment, and the casual violence that samurai could inflict on commoners without consequence. These rebellions were usually local and short-lived, quickly suppressed by warrior force, their leaders executed as examples to discourage further resistance, but they happened repeatedly, suggesting that beneath the surface of apparent stability, resentment simmered, that commoners did not simply accept their subordinate status but chafed against it, waiting for moments when resistance seemed possible or when conditions became so intolerable that the risk of rebellion seemed worth taking. The Ikoiki, uprisings of militant Buddhist believers beginning in the 15th century, represented more sustained and organized opposition. These movements united peasants and lower-ranking samurai around religious conviction and shared grievances, creating armies that controlled entire provinces, establishing self-governing communities that rejected the authority of the traditional warrior lords. They were motivated by faith in Amida Buddha and the promise of salvation regardless of social status, a religious egalitarianism that implicitly challenged the hierarchical order that samurai rule depended upon. For decades they successfully resisted powerful daimyo, proving that motivated commoners could defeat trained warriors when fighting for something they believed in deeply enough. Eventually the Ikoiki were crushed with overwhelming force and systematic brutality, their strongholds destroyed, their leaders killed, their communities dispersed. The suppression demonstrated the limits of resistance, the reality that spiritual conviction and courage could not indefinitely withstand superior military organization and resources. But it also showed that the system required violence to maintain itself, that consensus and voluntary acceptance were not sufficient, that power ultimately rested on the willingness to kill those who refused to submit. Within the samurai class itself, dissent existed, though it had to be expressed carefully. Some warriors questioned whether the code truly served justice, or merely justified the privileges of those strong enough to seize and hold power. They noticed the gap between professed ideals and actual behavior, the hypocrisy of lords who demanded absolute loyalty while showing none in return, who spoke of honor while acting from ambition, who claimed to follow Bushido while breaking its principles whenever convenient. These doubts rarely found public expression, too dangerous to voice openly, but they surface in private writings, in poems that question the purpose of violence, in letters that express weariness with endless conflict. Miyamoto Musashi, perhaps the most famous swordsman in Japanese history, represented a different kind of resistance. He rejected the comfortable certainty of serving a lord, choosing instead the dangerous freedom of the wandering ronin, the masterless samurai. He fought dozens of duels, killed dozens of men, but did so outside the system, according to his own code rather than anyone else's expectations. His Book of Five Rings, written late in life, presents a philosophy of combat and life that is intensely practical and individualistic, concerned with what works rather than what tradition prescribes, valuing direct experience over received wisdom. His path was rebellion through excellence, proving that a samurai could achieve mastery without lord or clan or inherited position. Ronin more generally represented structural resistance to the system, samurai without masters either by choice or circumstance, existing outside the normal relationships of obligation and support. Some Ronin became bandits, using their martial skills for personal gain rather than legitimate service. Others sought new lords, hoping to re-enter the system. Still others, like Musashi, carved out alternative existences, teaching or writing or pursuing arts, maintaining their identity as warriors without participating in warrior hierarchy. The very existence of Ronin was threatening to the system because it demonstrated that samurai identity did not require subordination to a lord, that warrior skills and values could exist independently of the social structures meant to control them. Christian converts in the 16th and early 17th centuries, including many samurai, represented ideological resistance. Christianity taught that all souls were equal before God, that earthly hierarchies were temporary and ultimately meaningless compared to divine judgment, that loyalty to God superseded loyalty to lords. These ideas were revolutionary in their implications, potentially subversive of the entire social order. Some samurai converted sincerely, finding in Christian teachings a spiritual home that Buddhism and Confucianism had not provided. Others saw political advantage in alliance with European powers. Regardless of motivation, their conversion challenged the religious foundations of samurai rule, the synthesis of Shinto, Buddhism, and Confucianism that legitimized hierarchy and duty. The Tokugawa shogunate eventually banned Christianity and persecuted converts with extraordinary cruelty, crucifying, burning, and torturing Christians until they recanted or died. The Shimabara Rebellion of 1637, a massive uprising of Christian peasants and ronin, was suppressed with methodical violence, tens of thousands killed. The persecution succeeded in driving Christianity underground, forcing surviving believers to practice in secret, hidden for 2 centuries until Japan reopened to the West. But the violence required to achieve this suppression revealed the threat that alternative ideologies posed, the fear that different values might undermine the system that samurai power depended upon. Women sometimes resisted in quieter ways, pushing against the restrictions that limited their roles and autonomy. Some samurai women insisted on their right to train in martial arts, to participate in family councils, to manage estates with authority rather than merely as caretakers for absent men. Letters and diaries preserve evidence of women who chafed against expectations, who wanted more than their designated roles allowed, who found ways to exercise agency even within strict constraints. Their resistance was usually individual rather than collective, accommodating rather than revolutionary. But it was resistance nonetheless, assertion of personhood against a system that often treated women as instruments of family strategy. Intellectuals and scholars sometimes questioned samurai values from philosophical grounds. They noted contradictions in Bushido, asked whether loyalty was truly the highest virtue or whether justice and humanity might sometimes demand disloyalty, whether accepting death was wisdom or a convenient way to avoid the harder work of living and improving society. These questions were dangerous, could result in punishment or exile if expressed too publicly, but they circulated in private discussions, in scholarly writings that used historical or foreign examples to make points about contemporary society. The questions persisted because they were legitimate, because the contradictions were real, because thinking people could not help but notice the gaps between what was claimed and what was practiced. The opposition to samurai rule and samurai values never coalesced into a unified movement capable of overthrowing the system. The resistors were too diverse, their motivations too different, their power too limited compared to the organized force that samurai commanded. But their existence mattered, demonstrated that the system was not natural or inevitable, but constructed and maintained through force and ideology, that alternatives were conceivable even if not achievable, that dissent survived even when suppressed. They remind us that history is not just the story of winners and their values, but also the story of those who resisted, who questioned, who refused to accept that power justified itself, who kept alive the possibility that things could be different, even when different seemed impossible. The Muromachi period, spanning from 1338 to 1573, witnessed a remarkable flowering of Japanese culture, even as the country endured political fragmentation and periodic warfare. This era saw the refinement and codification of arts and aesthetic principles that would come to define Japanese culture globally, practices and sensibilities developed in close association with the samurai class, who were simultaneously warriors and patrons, men of violence who cultivated refinement as counterbalance and complement to their martial roles. The cultural awakening of this period transformed the samurai from mere fighters into paragons of a distinctively Japanese approach to beauty, one that found profundity in simplicity and discovered transcendence in disciplined practice of everyday arts. Zen Buddhism reached its peak influence during these centuries, its temples becoming centers of learning and culture, its monks serving as advisors to shogunates and powerful daimyo. The Zen emphasis on direct experience, on breakthrough insight achieved through meditation and paradox, appealed deeply to warriors who needed to act decisively without hesitation, who faced death regularly enough to appreciate teachings about transcending dualistic thinking and ego attachment. Zen offered not just spiritual comfort but practical psychology, methods for achieving the clear mind that could function effectively under extreme stress, that could make life or death decisions without being paralyzed by fear or desire. From Zen emerged or was reinforced a distinctive aesthetic sensibility that permeated multiple arts. Wabi-sabi, the appreciation of imperfection and impermanence, found beauty in weathered surfaces, asymmetry, the incomplete and the modest. Where Chinese aesthetics often celebrated grandeur and perfection, Japanese Zen-influenced aesthetics embraced the humble and the transient, seeing in a cracked tea bowl or a rough-hewn flower contain a profound expression of deeper truths about existence. This aesthetic matched samurai experience, their awareness that life was fragile and fleeting, that polished perfection was illusion, that authenticity resided in accepting rather than denying impermanence. Tea ceremony evolved from simple gatherings where monks and warriors drank tea to stay alert during meditation into an elaborate art form that embodied Zen principles and choreographed ritual. Sen no Rikyu, the greatest tea master of the 16th century, refined chanoyu into something approaching religious practice, every movement prescribed and meaningful, the preparation and sharing of tea becoming meditation in action, host and guests collaborating to create a temporary perfect moment of shared presence. The tea room itself was designed to enforce equality, everyone regardless of rank entering through the same small doorway, requiring even the highest samurai to bow, to literally lower himself, removing swords before entering, leaving violence outside to participate in ritual of peace. Poetry, particularly the linked verse form called renga, became a group practice that samurai cultivated alongside martial skills. Multiple poets would gather to compose a sequence together, each contributing verses according to complex rules, the challenge requiring not just literary skill but social awareness, ability to read subtle cues, to build on what others created while adding something new. Successful renga required the same attention and discipline as successful swordsmanship, the mind focused but relaxed, present to the moment, responding spontaneously yet appropriately. Warriors found in poetry practice a way to sharpen mental faculties that served them in combat, cultivating awareness and quickness of response through aesthetic rather than martial means. Garden design became another arena for expressing philosophical depth through material form. The rock gardens of Zen temples, particularly Ryoanji in Kyoto with its 15 stones arranged in raked gravel, presented paradoxes that invited contemplation, seeming simple at first glance but revealing complexity through extended viewing, the relationships between elements shifting depending on perspective, the meaning never fixed but always provisional. Samurai lords commissioned gardens for their castles, spaces where they could walk and think, where the natural world was not reproduced but abstracted, essential qualities captured through careful selection and arrangement, artifice made to seem natural, nature refined to reveal structure. No theatre developed under samurai patronage, a highly stylized dramatic form that moved with deliberate slowness, actors masked and costumed, movements refined to essential gestures, stories drawn from history and legend exploring themes of honor, loyalty, ghosts and the weight of the past. Performances could last hours, the pace glacial by modern standards, demanding from audiences the same discipline that performers demonstrated, the ability to attend to subtle gradations of movement and sound, to find drama in restraint rather than excess. Miyamoto Kyo, who formalized No in the 14th and 15th centuries, wrote treatises on acting that were also philosophical works about presence and authenticity, about the flower that blooms through disciplined practice. Ink painting, influenced by Chinese models but developed in distinctive Japanese directions, became the favored visual art among Zen monks and samurai patrons. Sesshu Toyo, a Zen priest and painter of the 15th century, created landscapes and portraits using only black ink on white paper, the limited palette requiring absolute control and decisiveness, each brushstroke permanent and unrevisable, the white space as important as the black ink. His paintings captured both detailed observation of nature and abstract essence, particular mountains that were also universal principles, the visible world rendered in ways that suggested invisible depths beneath surface appearance. Flower arrangement, ikebana, evolved from Buddhist altar offerings into a practiced art with its own schools and philosophies. Unlike Western floral arrangements that often aimed for abundance and symmetry, ikebana emphasized asymmetry, space, the relationship between elements, using minimal materials to maximum effect. The practice required attention to seasonal appropriateness, to the natural growth patterns of plants, to the relationship between container and contents, to the position of each stem and leaf. Like tea ceremony, ikebana transformed a simple act into meditation, the practitioner achieving mental clarity through focused engagement, with natural materials and aesthetic principles. Calligraphy, the art of beautiful writing, was considered essential samurai accomplishment, skill with the brush as important as skill with the sword. The connection was explicit, both requiring similar mental states, focused intensity without tension, strength expressed through flexibility, movement flowing from center. A warrior's calligraphy was thought to reveal his character, his education and cultivation visible in how he wielded the brush, how he balanced elements of a composition, how his individual style emerged within the constraints of proper form. Calligraphy practice was daily discipline for many samurai, a way to maintain mental acuity and express aesthetic sensibility. This cultural flowering occurred not despite samurai violence, but alongside and in response to it. The same men who killed in battle created beauty and peace, the juxtaposition not accidental but essential to their worldview. Death's constant presence made beauty more precious, made the perfection of a tea ceremony or the composition of a poem matter intensely, because such moments were all humans really had, brief opportunities for meaning and connection in lives that could end at any moment. The arts were not escape from warrior reality, but engagement with it through different means, ways of processing and transcending violence without denying it, creating spaces where different values could be honored and different aspects of human nature expressed. The awakening was thus simultaneously aesthetic and spiritual, cultural and personal. The samurai class, or at least its most cultivated members, achieved a synthesis that balanced seemingly contradictory elements: warriors who were also poets, killers who practiced meditation, men of violence who created beauty, individuals bound by strict codes who pursued personal enlightenment. This synthesis became Japan's gift to world culture, an example of how a warrior class could be more than just fighters, how martial discipline could support rather than exclude artistic refinement, how acceptance of death could lead not to nihilism but to fuller engagement with life. The cultural forms developed during this awakening would endure for centuries, would spread beyond samurai to influence all levels of Japanese society, would eventually travel beyond Japan to influence global culture, proof that something profound and beautiful emerged from the moonlit nights when warriors laid down their swords to pick up brushes, to arrange flowers, to find in stillness and silence meanings that violence could not express. The deepest truth about the samurai, the revelation that emerges when all the evidence is weighed and all the contradictions acknowledged, is that they were never quite what they claimed to be. But in failing to embody their own ideals, they revealed something more profound about human nature than perfect adherence to Bushido ever could have. The samurai code demanded that warriors transcend fear, accept death without hesitation, serve their lords with absolute loyalty, maintain honor above all else. Yet the historical record shows countless examples of samurai who were afraid, who clung to life, who betrayed their lords, who chose survival over honor. This gap between ideal and reality is not a failure of the samurai, but the central truth of their experience. The human struggle to live up to impossible standards, to create meaning through discipline and code, even while knowing that perfection will always remain just beyond reach. The revelation begins with understanding that Bushido itself was aspirational rather than descriptive, a vision of what samurai should be, rather than what they actually were. The great texts of samurai philosophy, works like the Hagakure or Budosho Shinshu, were written by men looking backward, romanticizing a past they had not lived, creating ideal forms that had never existed in pure state. They wrote during the Edo period, when peace had transformed samurai from warriors into bureaucrats, when the code had become something to study rather than something to live or die by. Their wisdom was real, but abstracted from the messy reality of combat and political intrigue, refined into principles that sounded beautiful, but were extraordinarily difficult to apply in actual situations where lives and fortunes hung in the balance. The historical samurai were pragmatists as much as idealists, men who had to navigate complex political realities, who served lords that might be wise or foolish, just or cruel, successful or doomed. Absolute loyalty sounds noble in principle, but what did it mean when your lord made decisions that endangered the clan, when his choices seemed certain to lead to destruction? Some samurai followed their lords to ruin, choosing loyalty over survival, and these are the ones remembered and celebrated. But others switched sides, abandoned failing causes for winning ones, justified their betrayals through various rationalizations, and survived to found successful lineages. History was written by victors who naturally emphasized loyalty to themselves while condemning disloyalty in others, creating a selective record that obscured how common pragmatic adaptation actually was. The truth about courage and fear is equally complex. The samurai ideal presented warriors who faced death with complete equanimity, who charged into battle without hesitation, who met their ends with poems on their lips and serenity in their hearts. Some actually achieved this, or something approximating it. Men whose conditioning and conviction allowed them to function despite terror, whose training created automatic responses that overrode survival instinct. But many others were simply afraid, froze in crucial moments, fled when they should have fought, lived with shame and guilt afterward, struggled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, nightmares and flashbacks, and inability to reconcile what they had done or failed to do with the person they believed they should be. The revelation about honor is that it was often a luxury that only the powerful could afford. High-ranking samurai could maintain strict codes because their positions gave them options, because failing to achieve perfection might cost them status but not necessarily their lives. Lower-ranking warriors had less margin for error, their survival dependent on pleasing superiors who might be arbitrary or vindictive, their ability to provide for families requiring them to compromise ideals in ways that privileged samurai could avoid. The same code that gave meaning to some lives made others unbearable, the weight of expectations crushing men who lacked resources or luck or skill to meet them, who were caught between demands they could not fulfill and consequences they could not escape. Women's experiences reveal another dimension of the truth. Samurai wives and daughters lived under the code without having chosen it, their worth measured by how well they supported male relatives, their own desires subordinated to family strategy and clan needs. Some found meaning within these constraints, embraced their roles, achieved satisfaction through successful management of households or skillful arrangement of marriages. Others chafed against limitations, wrote poetry expressing frustration or longing, lived diminished lives because the code had no place for their talents and ambitions. The samurai system worked for some women, failed others, but rarely asked whether it should work for them, treating them as instruments rather than individuals with legitimate claims to self-determination. The economic reality underlying samurai culture exposes another truth. The beauty and refinement, the tea ceremonies and garden contemplation, and poetic composition, all required wealth extracted from peasant labour. The leisure to perfect aesthetic pursuits came from the rice tax, from the labour of farmers who had no choice but to produce surplus that fed samurai and funded their lifestyle. The sword that was supposedly the soul of the samurai was forged by craftsmen, maintained by servants, wielded by men whose position rested on systematic extraction of value from those they ruled. The aesthetic achievements were real and profound, but they were built on hierarchy and exploitation, beauty created through structures of domination. Perhaps the deepest truth is that the samurai needed Bushido precisely because they were not naturally inclined to follow it, that the code existed to constrain and channel tendencies that would otherwise have led to chaos. Warriors left to their own devices become warlords and bandits, using strength for personal gain, creating cycles of violence without purpose or limit. Bushido tried to transform raw martial skill into something higher, to convince warriors that they served ideals beyond self-interest, that their violence had meaning beyond immediate advantage. It succeeded partially and temporarily, creating a culture that was genuinely distinctive and at times admirable, but it never fully succeeded because the human material it worked with was always imperfect, always resistant to complete subordination to abstract principles. The revelation is ultimately about human beings trying to make sense of difficult lives, people caught in systems not of their choosing, attempting to create meaning and maintain dignity through adherence to codes that demanded more than they could consistently give. The samurai were not heroes or villains, but people, flawed and striving, sometimes achieving nobility and often failing, leaving behind a legacy that inspires and troubles because it reflects our own contradictions, our own struggles between what we aspire to be and what we actually are. They wanted to believe that discipline could overcome fear, that loyalty justified sacrifice, that honor mattered more than survival, that death could be accepted with grace. Sometimes they achieved these things, moments of transcendence when ideal and reality aligned, when the code became lived truth rather than abstract aspiration. but more often they fell short, compromised, rationalized, suffered, and endured. This imperfection is the revelation, the truth that makes the samurai fully human rather than mythological. Their value as historical and cultural figures lies not in having perfectly embodied Bushido, but in having tried to do so despite the cost, in having created a culture that took seriously questions about courage and loyalty and a meaning that every human being faces in some form. They showed that it was possible to live by a code even while failing to perfectly follow it, that the attempt mattered even when the achievement remained incomplete, that beauty could emerge from discipline even when discipline could not eliminate fear or doubt, or the basic human desire to survive and be happy. The samurai legacy is not a lesson in perfection, but a meditation on aspiration, on the gap between ideal and real, on what it means to try to be better than you are while accepting that you will never quite succeed, on finding meaning not in achievement but in the sincere effort to achieve, in the journey rather than the destination that always remains just beyond the horizon, beckoning in the moonlight. Looking back across centuries at the samurai, what can we learn that remains relevant to our own lives, our own struggles to find meaning and maintain dignity in circumstances we did not choose? The samurai lived in a world utterly different from ours, a feudal society where birth determined destiny, where violence was endemic and life was short, where values we consider fundamental like individual freedom and equality before law did not exist. Yet something in their story continues to resonate, speaks to concerns that transcend cultural and temporal boundaries, addresses questions that every generation must answer for itself about duty and desire, discipline and freedom, mortality and meaning. The samurai confronted directly what we often try to avoid, the fact of death, the certainty that life will end and probably sooner than we would like, that everything we build and everyone we love is temporary, that no amount of success or status can change this fundamental condition. Modern life, especially in wealthy societies, creates elaborate structures to distance us from mortality, medical systems that extend life, cultural narratives that emphasize youth and vitality, technologies that seem to promise eventual transcendence of biological limits. We can live our entire lives barely acknowledging that they will end, surrounding ourselves with distractions and denials, pushing thoughts of death to the margins of consciousness. The samurai took the opposite approach, made death central to their thinking and practice, meditated on it daily, prepared for it constantly, tried to accept it fully so that its inevitability would not paralyze them when action was required. This was not morbidity but realism, an attempt to base their lives on truth rather than comfortable illusions, to find in acceptance of mortality not despair, but clarity about what mattered. Whether their approach was psychologically healthy is debatable, whether it led to genuine peace or merely to a different kind of anxiety. But their willingness to confront what we avoid challenges us to consider whether our denials serve us well, whether pretending we will live forever actually helps us live better, or merely allows us to drift through life without fully engaging with its limited, precious nature. The question of discipline versus freedom appears throughout samurai history and remains urgent today. The samurai lived under extraordinary constraints, born into specific roles with specific obligations, their lives shaped by codes they did not choose and could not easily reject. Modern democratic societies theoretically value individual freedom, the right to choose one's path, to define success on personal terms, to change course if current direction proves unsatisfying. We are supposed to be free in ways the samurai never were, yet many people today feel adrift, overwhelmed by choices, uncertain which commitments deserve loyalty, struggling to find meaning in lives that offer maximum freedom but minimal guidance. The samurai found meaning through limitation, through accepting constraints and working within them, through perfecting skills and fulfilling obligations rather than constantly questioning whether they should be pursuing something else. Their discipline was imposed externally but became internalized, a framework that gave structure and purpose to daily life. We might ask whether complete freedom is actually liberating or whether some degree of chosen discipline, voluntary commitment to principles or practices or communities, actually enables deeper satisfaction than unlimited optionality. The samurai cannot tell us what to commit to, but they demonstrate that commitment itself, sustained dedication to something beyond immediate gratification, can be a source of meaning even when, perhaps especially when, that commitment demands sacrifice. The tension between individual desire and social obligation that defined samurai existence remains central to human experience. The code demanded that samurai subordinate personal wants to duty, that they serve their lord and clan before themselves, that they accept decisions made by superiors even when those decisions affected them profoundly. This subordination troubles modern sensibilities that emphasize individual rights and self-determination. We resist the idea that we should sacrifice our happiness for abstractions like duty or honor, suspect that such demands are usually tools of manipulation, ways to convince people to accept exploitation without resistance. Yet we also recognize that purely individualistic ethics create problems, that societies cannot function if everyone prioritizes personal desire over collective welfare, that some degree of obligation to others, to communities, to principles beyond self-interest is necessary for human flourishing. We struggle to find balance between individual and collective, between legitimate self-assertion and necessary cooperation, between freedom and responsibility. The samurai lived at an extreme point on this spectrum, subordination so complete that individual identity nearly disappeared into role. Their experience suggests dangers of that extreme, but also raises questions about whether we have swung too far in the opposite direction, whether our emphasis on individual fulfillment has costs we do not adequately acknowledge. The samurai pursuit of excellence in both martial and aesthetic domains offers another point of reflection. They insisted that a complete person should cultivate multiple dimensions, that the warrior should also be artist, that skill with the sword should be balanced by skill with the brush, that the ability to kill should be matched by the ability to create beauty. This integration challenges modern tendencies towards specialization, our assumption that excellence requires narrow focus, that becoming good at one thing means neglecting others. The samurai suggests that breadth can deepen rather than dilute expertise, that practicing multiple disciplines can create insights and capacities that pure specialization cannot achieve. Whether this integration was genuine or merely performative is debatable. Certainly many samurai were simply warriors who dabbled in arts because it was expected, their poetry conventional, and their tea ceremony mechanical. But the best achieved real synthesis found genuine connections between different practices, understood how meditation informed combat, how aesthetic discipline sharpened mental clarity, how creating beauty provided psychological balance to participating in violence. Their example invites us to consider whether our own lives might benefit from similar integration, from pursuing excellence in multiple domains rather than one, from balancing whatever our primary work is with practices that develop different capacities and perspectives. The samurai relationship with material culture, the attention they paid to objects and rituals, the way they invested everyday items and actions with meaning, speaks to our contemporary situation where we are surrounded by possessions but often lack deep connection to them. A samurai sword was not just a tool, but a sacred object, inherited across generations, believed to embody spiritual qualities, maintained with reverence and respect. Tea bowls were treasured, their imperfections appreciated, their use governed by elaborate protocols that transformed drinking tea into meditation. This intense focus on the material world as site of meaning contrasts with modern consumer culture, where objects are disposable, easily replaced, valued for novelty rather than history or craft. The samurai approach was not simply materialism, not about accumulating possessions, but about developing profound relationship with select objects through sustained attention and care. This suggests an alternative to both consumerism and asceticism, a way of engaging with the material world that finds depth through limitation and attention, rather than breadth and novelty. It raises questions about whether our endless acquisition of new things actually satisfies, or whether we might find more meaning in fewer possessions chosen carefully and valued deeply, used mindfully rather than casually. Finally, the samurai force us to confront the relationship between beauty and violence, between aesthetic refinement and capacity for cruelty, between high culture and brutal domination. They demonstrated that these are not opposites, that the same person can commit murder and create poetry, that sensitivity to cherry blossoms does not preclude indifference to human suffering, that cultural sophistication provides no immunity to moral blindness. This is uncomfortable truth, challenges our assumption that education and exposure to beauty make people more humane, that cultivating aesthetic sensibility necessarily improves ethical character. The samurai lived this contradiction without resolving it, created magnificent culture while maintaining oppressive hierarchy, found transcendent meaning in practices embedded in systems of violence and exploitation. Their legacy forces recognition that beauty and justice are not the same thing, that culture can flourish alongside cruelty, that humans are capable of holding contradictions that should be unbearable but somehow are born. This is perhaps their final lesson, that being human means living with contradictions, trying to create meaning and beauty despite our capacity for violence and selfishness, accepting that we are both more and less than we want to be, that perfection remains forever beyond reach, but that the attempt to achieve it, flawed and partial as it inevitably is, constitutes the only dignity available to us in our brief time beneath the moon. The samurai are gone now, dissolved into history, their class abolished in 1876 when the Meiji government modernized Japan and stripped warriors of their legal privileges, their right to wear swords, their stipends and their status. The last generation lived to see their world unmade, watched as everything they had been raised to value was suddenly declared obsolete, as Western dress replaced armor, as conscript armies made elite warrior training irrelevant, as money and industrial production became the measures of power rather than sword skill and martial virtue. Some adapted, found new roles in the modernizing nation, became bureaucrats or soldiers in the new army, or businessmen applying samurai discipline to commerce. Others struggled, unable to reconcile the world they had been prepared for with the world that actually existed. Men trained for honor in an age that valued efficiency, warriors without wars to fight. A few resisted the changes violently. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, was the samurai's last stand, a desperate attempt to preserve their way of life through force of arms. Saigo had been instrumental in overthrowing the Shogunate and establishing the Meiji government, but when that government began dismantling samurai privileges, he led a revolt of disaffected warriors who could not accept the new order. For 8 months they fought, traditional samurai tactics against modern weapons, swords and courage against artillery and rifles. The rebellion was crushed, Saigo died by his own hand, and with him died the last realistic hope that the samurai might continue as a functional warrior class rather than a historical memory. But even as the samurai disappeared as a social reality, they began to emerge as a cultural icon, their image preserved and romanticized, their code studied and mythologized, their legacy debated and deployed for various purposes. The Meiji government, even while abolishing samurai privileges, promoted Bushido as a national virtue, something all Japanese could aspire to embody, loyalty and discipline and self-sacrifice reframed as characteristics of the Japanese spirit rather than prerogatives of a specific class. This transformation of Bushido from samurai code to national ideology would have profound consequences, providing ethical framework for rapid modernization in the late 19th century, but also contributing to the militarism and nationalism that led Japan into disastrous wars in the 20th century. The physical remnants of samurai culture became sites of pilgrimage and preservation. Castles that survived the wars and modernization were designated national treasures, restored and maintained, open to tourists who walked through rooms where lords once held court, stood on ramparts where defenders had watched for approaching armies. Museums collected swords and armor, displayed them behind glass where they could be admired but not touched, transformed from functional objects into historical artifacts, beautiful but dead, their purpose fulfilled and ended. The transformation from use to museum piece paralleled the transformation of the samurai themselves, from living warriors to historical figures, from participants in ongoing culture to subjects of study and nostalgia. Martial arts schools preserved samurai techniques, teaching kendo and iaido and other disciplines to students who would never use them in actual combat. Sword skills maintained as physical meditation and cultural practice rather than preparation for war. The arts became divorced from their original lethal purpose, transformed into ways of cultivating character and connecting with tradition. The movement's the same, but the meaning fundamentally changed. A student practicing sword forms in a modern dojo is doing something both continuous with and utterly different from what a Kamakura period samurai did. The same techniques applied to different ends, violence refined into art, killing transformed into cultivation of self. Literature and film kept samurai stories alive, constantly retelling and reinterpreting their history, finding in medieval warriors material for exploring contemporary concerns. Each generation discovered different meanings in samurai narratives, emphasized different aspects of Bushido, created samurai who reflected current anxieties and aspirations as much as historical reality. The samurai became a mirror, a screen on which Japan and the world projected their fantasies and fears about honor and violence, tradition and modernity, discipline and freedom, individual and collective, all the tensions that define human social existence. The legacy is thus contradictory and contested, inspiring and troubling, beautiful and brutal. The samurai created culture of extraordinary refinement, arts and aesthetic principles that continue to move and instruct, demonstrations of how discipline and attention can transform everyday actions into profound practices. They also created and maintained a hierarchical society that oppressed most of its members, a system justified by violence and maintained through the constant threat of it, beauty built on domination. Both of these truths are real, both are part of the legacy, and neither can be separated from the other without distorting the historical reality. For those who visit Japan today, traces of the samurai are everywhere and nowhere. The castles and temples remain, physical structures testifying to their power and their patronage. The arts they cultivated continue to be practiced. Tea ceremony and flower arrangement and calligraphy still taught and valued. The swords rest in museums, their steel still perfect after centuries, still sharp enough to cut, still beautiful in the way they catch light. But the world that gave all these things their original meaning is gone, irrecoverable, accessible only through historical imagination, through the effort to see past our own assumptions and understandings, to grasp something of what it meant to live in that time, to be shaped by that code, to face those choices. The samurai haunt Japanese culture and global imagination, figures who will not quite disappear into the past, who continue to be summoned and interrogated, celebrated and condemned, used to justify and to question, to inspire and to warn. They represent a path taken, a way of organizing society and finding meaning that was tried, and eventually abandoned, but that left permanent marks on those who experienced it and those who study it. Their nights beneath the moon, their quiet moments in gardens between battles, their poetry written before death, their discipline and their violence, their beauty and their cruelty, all of it remains not as living tradition but as historical testimony, evidence of human possibility and human cost, what we can achieve and what we sacrifice to achieve it. Cherry blossoms still bloom in Japan every spring, their brief flowering still celebrated, their falling petals still beautiful and melancholy. The moon still rises over mountains and reflects in still water, indifferent to human affairs, witnessing without judgment the passage of generations and cultures and codes. The swords rest in museums, no longer cutting, no longer drinking blood, but still embodying the craft and care and deadly purpose that went into their making. And somewhere in the intersection of these images, the blossoms and the moon and the sword, the samurai endure, not as they actually were but as they have become in memory, moonlit figures walking between violence and beauty, duty and desire, life and death, trying to find honor in the darkness, trying to make meaning of brief lives in an uncertain world, trying to transcend mortality through acceptance of it, to achieve perfection through discipline while knowing that perfection remains impossible, to create something beautiful that might endure after they are gone. The samurai's night has ended, dawn has come, the long day of modernity has banished the moonlight and the mystery. But something of them remains, whispers in the dark, questions without final answers, a legacy both precious and problematic, a story that demands to be remembered even as it resists easy understanding, even as it troubles our certainties, even as it forces us to confront what we would rather avoid. The knowledge that we too are temporary, that we too must find meaning in difficult circumstances, that we too stand between ideals we cannot fully achieve and realities we cannot fully escape, that we too live beneath the same indifferent moon, trying to create beauty in the time we have, trying to face death with dignity when it comes, trying to leave something behind that testifies to our having been here, to our having tried, to our having sought honor in the moonlight, even when the moonlight offered no guarantees, no promises, nothing but its pale light by which to see our way forward into an uncertain darkness that waits for us all.